is Daf Samech Tet. Last night we started the new parak. It was just me and Nava, but we got a good start. Say Samech sorry, Samech today. So this parak is complicated, unlike the rest of Nedarim, which is also complicated. And it deals with a new concept, which we've discussed a lot before, which is very much vusas, is based on the psukim in Parshat Matot, which go through, and I would encourage you to go through it, it will help you with the Gemara, go through the question of hafara. So hafara, unlike the previous parak where we talked about hatara is basically where you make a neder, you regret the neder, right? Well, we talked about different kinds of hatara. You have nolad, you have charata, but for some reason you don't want the neder to be chal anymore, or there's new information. In hafara, it has nothing to do with that. Hafara has to do with control. So that a father is allowed to be mefer the nedarim of his daughter up till the age of 12 and a half, till she's a bogeret. Until she's a bogeret, she's considered to be in his reshut. And so anything she does, not anything, but nedarim that she makes, he can be mefer. And the same thing is true about a husband. So that a husband, for a woman, even if she's older than 12 and a half, of course, I don't know if that's of course, but it's true, can be mefer her nedarim. So if a woman who's married or a daughter living in her father's house makes a neder, that father or that husband can say on the day that they hear about the neder, I don't want this neder to be chal, and it just disappears, right? And the Torah says, Hashem yislach la, Hashem forgives her, meaning if she then goes against her neder, there's no sin. So she makes a neder, I'm not going to eat strawberries for 30 days. And her husband says, I don't accept that neder, and then she goes and eats them, there's nothing wrong because it's no neder. The reason our Mishnah got into this discussion is that there's a middle case. And we learned from the Psukim yesterday, well, I'm going to read it again today, that in fact there's a middle case, which is a woman who is both a na'ara, so she's still in her father's reshut, she's up to the age of 12 and a half, but she's also, and the reason that's important is that even if she's living at home, but she's a bogeret, then her father has no control over her nedarim. She's considered to be independent. And the second thing is that she's orasa. She's engaged, what we call engaged, which is really marriage, but just the first step of marriage, where you don't live yet in the husband's home, but you live in the father's home, the parents' home. And so in that case, the pasuk we learned from different psukim yesterday, there's a middle ground. And the middle ground is that the father and the husband have the right and the necessity to be mefer her nedarim. If just one does it and not the other, her neder stands. If both do it, the neder does not stand. Now, just as a side point, since we have side points, the psukim, which again I read yesterday, but the language is, I'm going to read it, I have to find it. This is in Parshat Matot, Parak Lamed in Bamidbar. It says, Isha, well, let me read some more. It says, one second, let's find the pasuk that I like. I'm not quite finding a pasuk that I like. So here we go. All the pasuk Yud Daled in that parak. It says, Kol neder v'chol shvuat isar, every neder and every shvuah, la'anot nafesh, that causes inoi nefesh. Remember, inoi nefesh is the language we use by Yom Kippur, right? Things that cause you to suffer, not eating, not drinking, not washing. Those things, isha yikimenu, isha yiferenu. The husband or her husband can keep them, or her husband can be mefer them. The question is, does it only apply to those nedarim? And we're going to see today that we generally assume that when you're dealing with the husband, he only has power over things that are painful for her. So if she makes a neder that's not painful, right? It's not inoi nefesh. That's like something very, more benign. I'm not going to go to a baseball game or whatever it might be. Because I'll not use that example, but it's not something that causes her to suffer, then the husband can't get rid of it. It's her own business. If she says, I no longer want to wear red clothing, I'm only going to wear yellow clothing, the husband can't undo that because it's not relevant for her suffering. The husband can only impact nedarim that are inoi nefesh. There's a machloka whether it applies to the father also, right? Whether a father also can only control his child in regards to inoi nefesh, or he can control for everything. But that's certainly the case for a husband.
The Inui is in terms of her Inui
Yeah,
or his
Inoy is
Inui?
in terms of her.
Not
So,
his.
some presumption is that he can say it. It's not in my interest that you're weak or that you're not yourself. So the Inoy is her Inoy, yeah, not his Inoy. Obviously, she can't do his Inoy. So I'm going to add to it. So don't go home and write that down yet, because the Gemara today is going to add another case. But that's the presumption, is that it's only Inoy Nefesh. So now, says the Gemara on the top of Daf Samachet Amud Aleph. I'm going to stay awake. You're doing a great job now. The Bei Rabbi Yishmael Tana. Rabbi Yishmael said, we have a whole other source for how you know that there's this middle ground of a Na'ara HaMorasa who requires her father and her husband to be Mefer her Nedarim. And that is the pasuk at the end of that whole parsha, which I'm not reading right now, says these are the things that were taught, Bein ish le'ishto, bein av le'bito, bin ureha beitovia, is what it continues. Things between a husband and his wife, and a father and his daughter. So what, again, if the unmarried girl is her father and the married one is her husband, what's both of them, right? Where do you have a situation where both the father and the husband have a role? That's this middle ground. Mikan the Na'ara Morasa. This teaches you, and this is a reference that when a woman who is both a Na'ara, so she's still living in her father's house, but she's Mi'orasa, she's betrothed to a man, then in that case, Avia Uba'ala Mefirin Nidara. Both her father and her husband are necessary if they want to uproot her neder. Says the Gemara, well, according to Tana Rabbi Yishmael, what about the pasuk we quoted yesterday that Rava quoted to prove it, which was the pasuk of V'im Hayot Ish. If she married, the pasuk says if she's to a man, then her husband has to have a role as well. My avilei mukim le'idach de Rabba. He uses that as we're going to have not tomorrow, but in 2 days, another halacha of Rabbah, which is a whole separate halacha, which we'll get to, which is a fascinating halacha, which is what happens if a woman, a 12-year-old girl, has more than one husband, right? Meaning what happens if she gets engaged and then her husband dies or divorces her, and then she gets engaged to another husband. She's still 12, right? So the question is, who's Mefer her Nedarim then? Does she lose the status of her father's house, or does she go back to her father's house? Tana Rabbi Yishmael learned from the pasuk. Rab is going to say later. It says Vim Hayo Tiyeh Ish. If she is to a man, but it repeats the language Hayo Tiyeh, and later we're going to learn that it means she can marry twice. That even if she's twice married, not obviously at the same time, but Hayo Tiyeh, so that she was married once. Erison, not Nisuin, married once with Erison. The marriage ended because the husband died, let's say, and then she got Erison a second time. That the halacha still applies in the second time that her father and her husband are Mefer her Nedarim. So that's a halacha that Tana Rabbi Yishmael learned from the pasuk of Hayotiyah. Says the Gemara of Rava or Rabba, but let's say Rava because that's what we said yesterday. Hi, the Tana Rabbi Yishmael my avidlay. What do they do with this extra pasuk of Tana Rabbi Yishmael? Of Bein Ish Lishto Bein Av Lebito, they use it Mibayle Lomar Shahabal Mefir Nidarim Shebeino Levena. They add something to what I just told you, which is that the pasuk makes it sound like a husband can only be Mefir a neder that is La'anot Nefesh. This pasuk adds something new, that not only can a husband be Mefir a neder that's La'anot Nefesh, but a husband can be Mefir any neder that affects him personally. That's Beino Levena. So even if it's not Inui Nefesh, if she says, I might, in fact, it's better for her. I make a neder. I'm not gonna cook dinner, right? So that's not Inui Nefesh for her, right? It makes life easier. But because it impacts him, he can be made for that neder. So basically, there's two categories based on this pasuk. One, Inui Nefesh, her own deprivation, which the husband can uproot if he wants to. And the second is any neder that affects him directly, that affects their relationship or their interaction, he also has power over that neder. And that's what we learn from this pasuk, because it says, Bein ish li'ishto, anything that's between a husband and his wife. This is where the Ran quotes the Machloket, the Ramban and the Rambam and others as to whether the same rule applies to a husband or not. So because the pasuk makes it sound like, nefesh only is by a husband, by a father. But the Ramban and others seem to learn, and not only, he quotes actually Yerushalmi and a Tosefta, which say it directly, Yerushalmi, sorry, that say it directly that this halacha is the same for a father as for a husband, and just like a husband can only be mefer nedarim that are either inui nefesh or beino levena, the same thing is true about a father. The Rambam argues with that. The Rambam says that a father can be made for any neder no matter what. The father's complete control until she's 12 and a half. In those days, maybe today would be older. Anyways, continues the Gemara. Ibaylu. Now the rest of today's daf is going to be consumed with the following question. And it seems on the surface to be a very silly question. Obviously it's not, but the question is this. The fact is that when a woman who's a na'ara morasa makes a neder, it takes two parties to be made for her neder, a father and a husband. The question is, what happens when one of those parties, I'm assuming you're going to go either order, is made for the neder, right? Is that made for half the neder, but the other half remains until the other party does it? Or does it basically weaken the entire neder, but it doesn't uproot it completely? So as the Gemara, we'll ask in a second what the difference is. But Iboilu, Baal, when a husband is made for a neder without the father, right? The father hasn't come yet. The husband is made for the neder. Do you say that the Baal is megiz gayas, that he's cut off part of it? Gayas means to cut off. So basically, he's uprooted part of the neder, but not the whole thing, because she's still in her father's reshut, and her father still has some control, and therefore he's not completely independent. Oh, do you say, and therefore the father needs to come and get rid of the rest? Or do you say, miklish kalish, the husband weakens the complete neder, that the whole neder is now a minor neder, let's say, right? So that she said, I'm not going to eat potatoes, and if she did eat potatoes, she'd be chayav al karban chatat. Now that the husband said, I'm getting rid of your neder, she no longer would be chayav karban. She can't go ahead and eat them because she's not allowed to unless her father also says, I don't want the neder. But the whole neder becomes weaker. Ask Gemara, what's the case that would make a difference for? Gigon de nadra mitrain zaytin. Let's say she made a neder from 2 zaytin, meaning 2 quantities of olives, and her arus heard, Shama arus, her husband heard, or her betrothed person heard, the hefirla, and he said, I want to get rid of your neder. Of course, you got to eat olives. It's not, assuming that's inoy nefesh, I guess, not eating olives. And achaltan, and then she ate 2 olives, right? So in that case, if you say that the husband can cut off part of the neder, so he cut off half the neder, but the other half still remains. And the fact that she ate an olive and she had a neder that she wasn't going to eat an olive means that she gets makot. She gets malkut. But miklish kalish, if you say that the husband has the power to weaken the entire neder, so then she's not chayav chatat at all, because it's not really a neder. The husband has basically diminished the whole thing. It's not permitted yet because her father has not given his blessing. But isura ba'almahu, it's just a prohibition, but not a chiyuv of chatat in that case. So that is a practical difference between how you view the power of the husband before the father. So,
but can't you be flogged even for a rabbinic prohibition?
Potentially? Well, I mean, you could be flogged rabbinically, but obviously it's a different quality of being flogged, potentially. So the point is you're chayiv in isur doraita. Yechanan, sorry.
What if the father or the husband wasn't around? Don't they have a time limit to do it, like 24 hours?
So yes, so the pasuk says that right? Pasuk says you can do it on the day you hear it.
Let's say the father was away for 30 days, on a travel.
So there's no 30-day limit. There's yom. It's just the day you hear it. So
until he hears.
So it depends. I mean, it would be so right. So it's a very risky thing, right? Because when the father hears, he says, "I want to be made for the neder," then there was no neder. So everything she ate for the last 30 days is permitted. But if the father doesn't say that, then everything she ate was prohibited. So it is a little tricky.
But if the husband depends maybe on which view of what.
Correct. So that's exactly the proof we're going to bring from a little bit of a different case. This is very complex. Just to make that point many times.
But
part of the complexity.
This is the same thing that we have, where there's joint tenants with the brothers and stuff.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say it's the only complex thing.
Argument. It just goes around and around. Is it?
Well, part of the reason it's so complex, and we discussed this yesterday a little bit, but I don't want to get into it because it'll be too far off, is that, generally a father, every netter that a daughter makes was made when the person was her father, right? You can't make a netter before a person's your father, but you can make a netter before a person's your husband, right? So we had a discussion, a little bit of a discussion yesterday. We're going to discuss this even more about whether a Baal can be meifir b'kodmin, whether a husband can be meifir Nedarim that happened before he was her husband. So let's say a woman makes a netter that she's not going to eat olives, and then she gets married the next day. And the husband's like, wait a second, this is ridiculous. I want to be meifir. So now, again, the pasuk says you can only do it on the day you hear about it. But let's say he didn't hear about it. He didn't know about it. Then he became her husband. So we said yesterday, and this is clear, there's some exceptions, but this is halacha, is that a husband cannot be meifir in anything that happened before he got married to her. However, an arus can. So a husband who's only engaged can, because he does it with the father, and the father, there's no kodman. So basically, if a woman gets engaged and she had previously made a netter that she wasn't going to eat olives, and then her new husband now hears about it, he has to be made for that netter in order for it not to be chal with the father. So it's very complex, right? Because if the father had heard about it before they were engaged and said he was meifir, the netter's gone. The father didn't hear about it, and then she got engaged, and then he heard about it. Then the father doesn't have power anymore. He relies on the husband. So you can see how it could get very complex. The proof we're going to bring today are from several braitot that are quoted 2 days from now, 2 dapim, which are a tosefta. Tashma. Let's come and prove it. We have 5 cases in the tosefta, and that's the rest of today's daf. 5 cases. Says the halacha later of the Mishnah is an interesting halacha, which is, let's say a woman makes a netter, and her father and her husband hear about the netter, and one of them dies before saying yes or no. So the question is, what happens to that right of that father or husband, right? Does it just disappear? Can the other party now take over as if it was complete? So it's very clear, and we're going to discuss this now, that if a woman is engaged and she makes a netter and her father dies, or let's say she doesn't have a father. Let me put it this way. A woman is an orphan. She gets engaged to a man. She's 12 years old. She's only arusa. She makes a netter. The arus can never be made for that netter. Because even though there's no father, the Torah clearly says you need the father and the arus. If there's no father, there's no hafara of that netter. Period. Okay, so a woman who's an orphan, who's arusa, can make any nedarim. No one can change those nedarim. And she can make before she's arusa, if she's old enough, right? So that is clear, right? You need the father. But what about the following cases? Tashma. So let's prove it from the following brayto. We're 5 lines from the bottom of Samachet Amud Aleph. Imatai Amru. When did they say that if the husband dies, not if the father dies, but if the meitabal, the husband dies, nitrokna reshut la'av, that the power of the husband to be made for her netter goes to the father. Again, this is a 12-year-old girl. She's engaged. She makes a netter. Her husband dies. So usually her husband and her father would be made for a netter. Her husband dies. The Mishnah says the power of her husband goes back to her father, and her father can be made for her netter. So now it says the Braita, when is that true? That is in the case, Bisman, 3 lines from the bottom now, Shelo Shama Habal Kodem Shiamot, where the husband did not know about the netter before he died. So he never had a chance to be mefer. Oh, Sheshama V'Shatak. Or the husband heard about the netter and he was quiet. But remember, if you're quiet, the netter takes effect as long as the next day passes. But he died the same day, right? So he heard about it on Monday on his deathbed. He dropped dead before he was able to say, I want it or I don't want it. Oh, Sheshama V'Hafer. Or he heard it and he said, I don't want it. Umeit bo bayom, and he died that day. This is really referring on the last case, on the shatak, right? In all of those cases, so again, the husband either didn't know about it or he heard about it, but he objected basically, or he didn't not object. So then when the husband dies, the right of the husband goes back to the father. Because there's no husband, the father now can be mefer in place of the husband. Zui Sheshanino, continues the Braita. This is where we learned that Mei Tabal, if the husband dies, nitrokna reshut la'ach. The power goes to the father. Aval, continues the Braita, second case. Im shama v'kiyem. If the husband heard about the neder and he said, I think it's a great idea for you not to eat olives. I actually think that's wonderful. Well, life will be cheaper or something. I don't know, whatever reason. I'm happy with you not eating olives. And then he died, right? Oh, sheshama v'shatak. Or the husband heard and he didn't say, I'm against it. And the day passed, which automatically means that it's chal, right? You get 1 day. Umeit biyom shalacharav. Then the day passes and he dies the next day. So in those cases, basically, the husband's dead. The father hears about this neder that she said, I'm never going to eat olives, or I'm not going to eat them for 30 days. And he says, that's outrageous. No one can live in my house not eating olives. I want to be made for your neder. She says, tough, Dad, right? My husband, who's dead, my ex-husband, my widowed, I guess. What do you call it? I forgot the language. Anyways, my deceased husband was for the neder. And because at the time that I made the neder, I was in his reshut as well, and he was pro the neder, you, the father, cannot uproot the neder, right? It's ein yachol lahafer. The father cannot be made for that neder because the husband basically upheld it. He was mekayim. Okay, that's the second case. The next case is 2 lines through. We'll see why. We're recording these all for the last case, so don't worry yet. The next case is Shama Avia. Now, let's say instead of the husband dying, the father hears about the neder, and the father says, I think it's a terrible idea that you should not eat olives. And he's made for the neder, and the husband never heard about the neder, right? He was sick in the hospital. Lo he speak bal lishmoa. Not sick. The other one died. He didn't hear about the neder. Ad shemei ta'av. Then the father died, right? So now the father said, I don't want the neder. The father's dead. The husband, who she's married to, right? She was married before her father died, says he hears now, oh, she made a neder. She's not going to eat zaitim. Her father said it was a bad idea. You might think the husband now can say, I think it's a bad idea also, but he can't. Because remember that the husband can only be made for a neder if the father is around at the same time to be made for the neder. Zu hisha shaninu, this is what we learned, that mei ta'av, that if the father dies, lo nidrokna reshut l'bal. The reshut does not go to the husband, because basically, the way the Ran sort of understands it, is that essentially, if you say the reshut goes to the other one, you basically have to take over the right of the father and add to it. But the husband never takes over the right of the father. And so in that case, even though the father already said, I don't want the neder, because the father's not alive now when the husband hears about it, the husband cannot be made for a neder on his own. Remember, he's only arus. If it was nisuah, it might be different, but of course, then you can be made for rekodman, right? So in that case, the father's death does not give power to the husband. But the next case, Shama Ba'ala, which is the flip side of that case, right? If the husband hears about it, and he says, I don't want you to have this neder, right? Firla. Below he speak ha'av l'shma ad shemita ba'al. The father doesn't hear about it until the husband dies. And then the next day, the husband's dead. She goes back to her father's house and she says, Dad, I made a neder not to eat olives, and my husband thought it was a terrible idea. The father then gets the right to say, I also think it's a terrible idea, and you don't have any neder. Zui sheshanino, in the last end of the first wide line, meitabal nitrokna l'shut ha'alav. It's correct. That's why, so the Ran goes through, this is why there's a very long Ran here. That is a different reason. The reason is that there's a capability of a woman who's engaged, like I said in the beginning, to have her engaged husband die or get divorced, and then go back to her father and re-engaged, right? So because she can be back in her father's reshut, her father basically gets full power over her now to be made for her neder, unless, as we said in the first case, before the husband died, he said, I want your neder to be mekayem, because then it already upheld. Even though he's dead now, the neder is chal, right? So anyways, these are all somewhat side cases. We're getting close. One more case. two more cases. Shama ba'ala v'haferla. Let's say the husband, right, got this 2 lines on the bottom. The husband heard about her neder and he said, I don't like this neder. He was meifir. And lo speak ha'av l'shmoa ad shemei. The father never even heard about it until he died. So the father dies without ever hearing about this neder. Then, and this is similar to what we've been saying, the Ran goes through why it's a chiddush in each case. Ein habal yachol lahafer. Even though there's no father, the father never heard about the neder, so he was never a party to it. But the husband cannot be made for the neder because she'ein habal mefer ela b'shutfut. The husband's hafara can only occur in partnership with the father. As like I said in the beginning, if there's no father, there can be no hafara of a me'urasa, of ominous me'urasa. So that's that case. The reason we're quoting this is for this final case, on the top of daf samach teh. The final case, the fifth case of this braita, is this case. Let's say Shama Avia. The father heard about her neder, that she's not going to eat olives. The haferla, and he said to her, it's a terrible neder. I am meifir, I uproot, I negate this neder. And the husband, she's engaged, right? The husband, lo hispik habal l'shmoa ad shemet. The husband has not heard about it, and he died. So he didn't have the ability to say yes, he didn't say no, he never even knew about it. So then says the Braita, Ozer ha'av umefer chalko shabal. The father has to go back and can go back and do a second hafara, right? The father did hafara already. But the hafara the father did was when there was a husband who was alive. And so the father's hafara is only a partial hafara. Now that the husband is no longer alive, the father gets full power to go back and make a second hafara. And the way the Ran understands this is that it's not that his first hafara is enough. And it's not that he does a new one completely. He basically gets the rights of the husband who's dead, and he does the husband's hafara. Right? That's what the Braita says. And says Rabbi Natan, this is all again a quote from later, says Rabbi Natan in the third line, Hein divrei Beit Shammai. This, in fact, is the opinion of Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai says that a husband who dies gives over his power of hafara to the father. But Beit Hillel says, Ein yachol lahafer. According to Beit Hillel, you cannot be mefer because there's no way to pass on that hafara. There's no way to pass it on. So what do you see from here, says the Gemara, and this is why we quoted this whole thing. Shma mina, that the Beit Shammai megiz guys. And according to Beit Shammai, the nature of this relationship is that each one has 50% or 80% or 20%, whatever the numbers, doesn't matter. Each one has a percentage. And the father uses his percentage up. The husband has not used his up, but the husband dies. His percent goes to the father. The father can then be mefer on behalf of that percent. And that's why Beit Shammai says the father can do it. According to Beit Hillel, though, what happens basically is, this is how the Ran understands it again, is that the father, or whoever goes first, weakens the whole neder. And so the neder is a weak neder now, basically miklash kalish, right? Beit Hillel holds miklash kalish. And because of that, the only right that the Torah gives is for the other person, the father, in this case, the husband, to also be meifir and get rid of the rest of it. But if the husband dies, again, this is how the Ran understands it, that portion that's left in the neder is too weak, it's too garua for it to be inherited or to go to the father. And so because of the nature of it, so if you think each one's doing a part, father does his part, the husband died before he did his part, that part just goes to the father. But according to Beit Hillel, the nature of what the father and the husband are doing together is that basically one is essentially uprooting the whole neder from a doraita part, and the other one is getting rid of the isur that's involved in that neder. And because the nature of the second one is so weak, that's not something that can be passed on or can be done by a father after a husband dies. And so that's the Ran, it's a very interesting language of the Ran, but the Ran basically says that because of that, it's too weak, right? The neder was weakened. I'm reading the words now in the narrow lines. Eino chashuv laharisho la'av. it's not respectable enough to be inherited to go to the father, because of that. And so therefore, because it's a weak neder, the father cannot be mefer. And so that Shema Mina is basically, we prove from here the answer to the question that we started with, which is the power of the father and the husband a nature of each one does part, or one weakens it and the other completes it? And it turns out it's a machlokes Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. According to Beit Shammai, each one does part. And so basically they're essentially independent parts of the neder. And the implication would be that if a woman made a neder that she's not going to have two different things, two different olives, and the father was mefer and she ate both olives, she would get makot, because since the husband has not been mefer, that part is still alive. And according to Beit Hillel, there would be no makot because the whole hafara, the first one, weakens the entire neder. So it's no longer a regular neder. She can't eat the olives because it's still a partial neder, but that partial neder can only be uprooted by the husband or the father. It can't be inherited or passed on if that person dies. So that is the Ran's explanation. The Ran makes a comment, I'll just read it because it's very interesting, where he says, Chazina, on the end of this first Ran on Samachtet, I've seen the Rabbanan Tshuva, many Rabbanan, Mili Delo Nihir, Velo Barira, many words about this that are not clear and are not enlightening. Velo Chayshina Lemichtavinu, I don't even think it's worth writing about them. So this is obviously a very subtle point, and there's a lot of debate. So what exactly is the difference? But the Ran felt like there's a lot of opinions out there that are not even worth the paper. So that's his explanation. And so we'll stop here. We're going to continue tomorrow with we'll continue tomorrow with a related question, and then obviously get back into this in 2 dapim, because this is a long quote from the Gemara later. But that is where we'll stop tonight. Let me ask about tomorrow. I'm off work tomorrow, so I'm happy to do the daf. I just don't know what time is best for everyone. Any votes?
If it's going to be in the evening, a little bit later would be better for me.
Okay, what about you, Hanan? What's your vote?
I'll go. I'm not sure, so whatever. I'll go along with whatever. I could do it.
Miriam, what about you? What's your vote?
I can do it in the evening also, the same way as tonight.
So you want to do 8 o'clock? Does that work?
8 o'clock would be great.
8 would be amazing.
Well, that's 9 for us, so the restaurant will close, so that should be okay.
Okay.
But you're in
8
a different
o'clock.
time zone now.
Yeah, but you're earlier, right?
Yeah, she'll be, our 8 is her 7, unless you make it to El Paso, in which case she'll be 6.
Okay, we're gonna say 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. I hope you can join us, Hanan. Eastern time. I'll put it on the WhatsApp.
Okay. So what happens if there's no father? So the father died or something.
So then no one can be made for her Nedarim until
No.
she's Nesua. You know, once she's married, then her husband has complete control over anything she makes once she's married.
What if it's an arus?
Then there's no hafara. We're going to discuss it in the Mishnah later. You can't do any hafara without a father.
So if the father's not around for whatever reason.
And whatever neder she makes is her own. It stays.
She's stuck with it.
Yeah.
Uh,
Remember, there's a whole different discussion, which now and I talked about yesterday a little bit too, which is if a woman makes a neder and then she gets married and her husband says, I was hoodwinked, right? I didn't know that you were never going to take a shower or something. Right. So that's a different question. That's a ta'ot. That's a mistake in the marriage. If it's something that has a big impact, right? But this is a different question. This is a question of whether he can uproot it or not.
No, we're gonna take showers.
Whatever the example might be. Anyways, okay. No, that is one of the examples of the Mishnah, right? She says, I won't wash. That's one of the examples. Anyways, Shavuot Tov, I guess it's still Sunday. Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock, hopefully.
Happy Gregorian New Year.
Too.
Thanks.